The Galactic Environmental Preservation Council possessed all the environmental awareness of a strip mining operation, and roughly half the charm. Established 3 millennia ago by species who had already thoroughly strip mined their way through 2 star systems, the Council approached planetary preservation with the same enthusiasm most beings reserved for tax audits. Their headquarters, a sterile chrome monument to bureaucratic inefficiency, orbited the capital world like a metallic tumor against the stars. Most civilized species had mastered the delicate art of environmental management through what scholars generously termed calculated resource extraction. The Zenthari would descend upon a world, catalog its mineral wealth within 72 standard hours, extract everything remotely valuable, and leave behind perfectly manicured park spaces for the 3 remaining species that could survive in depleted soil. The Vorthak preferred a more systematic approach, dividing planets into neat zones: mining sector, agricultural sector, waste disposal sector, and a small natural preservation area, roughly the size of a municipal parking structure. This was civilization. This was progress. This was how rational beings managed their galactic expansion without getting bogged down in sentimental attachments to every crawling, flying, or photosynthesizing organism that happened to evolve in inconvenient locations. Then the humans arrived, and everything went spectacularly wrong. The first sign of trouble came when human research vessel Curiosity requested permission to establish what they called comprehensive, ecological survey stations on 12 different preserved worlds. The Council initially approved the request, assuming humans possessed the same sensible approach to planetary resources as every other spacefaring species. After all, how much trouble could a few research teams cause? The answer, as it turned out, was considerable. Within a standard month, human researchers had established sprawling camps that looked less like scientific installations and more like permanent settlements designed by someone who had consumed too much stimulating vegetation. Instead of the expected mineral surveys and resource assessments, humans began transmitting excited reports about something called biodiversity hotspots and endemic species population. They spoke of these discoveries with the kind of breathless enthusiasm typically reserved for locating new hyperlane routes, or discovering planets made entirely of precious metals. Council Administrator Keth 9947, the Zenthari bureaucrat whose career had been built on the solid foundation of predictable species behavior, found himself assigned to monitor these peculiar newcomers. His first official report to the Council had been a masterpiece of diplomatic understatement. Human research methodologies appear unconventional but pose no immediate threat to established extraction protocol. 3 months later, Keth 9947 was beginning to question both his professional judgment and his species' understanding of sanity. The humans had somehow managed to catalog over 14,000 individual species on Kepler 4e-2b alone, a world the Council had designated for eventual mineral extraction once the paperwork cleared the appropriate committee. More disturbing, they seemed genuinely excited about each discovery, no matter how microscopically insignificant. Human researchers would spend entire days studying organisms that served no apparent purpose in any rational economic framework. On Proxima Centauri Secai, a team of human xenobiologists had established what they grandly termed a long-term behavioral observation post, to study the social interactions of crystalline entities that spent most of their existence doing absolutely nothing productive. The humans watched these creatures with the dedication of religious zealots, taking detailed notes on their feeding patterns, reproductive cycles, and what the research team insisted on calling cultural tradition. The breaking point came when Keth 9947 received a request from the human team on Gliese 667cc for additional funding to study microbial ecosystem dynamics in extreme thermal environments. They wanted to spend 6 standard months analyzing bacteria that lived in volcanic vents, bacteria that had no commercial applications, no medicinal properties, and no apparent function beyond existing in places where rational organisms had the good sense to avoid. Yet the humans spoke of these microscopic entities as if they had discovered the fundamental secrets of the universe, hidden in single-celled organisms that most species would eliminate with a basic sterilization protocol. Keth 9947 transmitted his weekly report with growing bewilderment. The humans had transformed routine planetary surveys into something resembling the universe's most elaborate nature documentary, complete with researchers who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about ecological niches and symbiotic relationships, as if these concepts held profound cosmic significance. The council chambers buzzed with confused speculation about human motivations. Were they conducting some elaborate form of psychological warfare? Had their species developed a form of collective mental disorder? Or were they simply the most inefficient researchers in galactic history, incapable of distinguishing between valuable resources and biological debris? Nobody suspected that the humans might actually know something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. The human condition, Keth 9947 was beginning to suspect, might be classified as a galaxy-wide mental health crisis, if the Council possessed sufficient bureaucratic forms to document such phenomena. What had started as eccentric research behavior had evolved into something approaching species-wide dementia, complete with symptoms that defied every known model of rational scientific inquiry. The humans had begun adopting alien species, not in any sensible commercial context, mind you. They were not harvesting exotic creatures for pharmaceutical research, or capturing specimens for wealthy collectors willing to pay premium prices for conversation pieces. Instead, human research teams were developing what they termed conservation protocols for organisms that any reasonable species would have eliminated as ecological inconveniences decades ago. On Wolf 35-9b, a world scheduled for atmospheric processing once the Council approved the necessary environmental impact assessments, human researchers had established a breeding program for something they called luminescent moss entity. These organisms possessed the remarkable ability to glow faintly in darkness while contributing absolutely nothing to any known economic sector. The humans treated these glowing patches of primitive plant matter as if they were preserving galactic treasures, carefully monitoring their growth patterns and documenting their unique bioluminescent communication methods. The research reports made Keth 9947's administrative sensibilities. Human scientists would spend weeks analyzing the complex social hierarchies of gas-based lifeforms that existed as sentient atmospheric disturbances on high-gravity worlds. They documented the feeding behaviors of silicon-based predators that hunted by vibrating through rock formations, describing their sophisticated pack coordination strategies with the kind of academic reverence typically reserved for studying advanced civilization. Most bewildering of all, the humans seemed genuinely fascinated by ecological relationships that served no practical purpose. They would map intricate food webs connecting dozens of species in patterns so complex that Keth 9947's data processors required additional memory cores to store the information. Human researchers spoke excitedly about keystone species and trophic cascades, as if these biological interactions contained secrets more valuable than rare mineral deposits. The Council's attempts to redirect human efforts toward productive activities had achieved results that could charitably be described as catastrophic failures. When Senior Administrator Vex Prime suggested that human teams focus their considerable analytical skills on identifying exploitable resources, the humans responded by submitting detailed proposals for sustainable extraction methodologies that would preserve what they called ecosystem integrity. Their suggested mining protocols involved leaving 80% of identified mineral deposits untouched to maintain habitat stability. Their recommended agricultural development plans allocated more land for biodiversity corridors than actual crop production. When presented with opportunities to establish profitable manufacturing centers, humans insisted on conducting environmental impact assessments that lasted longer than most species' industrial revolution. Keth 9947 found himself scheduling increasingly frequent meetings with council department heads, who were running out of creative ways to explain human behavior to their respective oversight committees. The Department of Resource Acquisition reported that human teams would identify valuable deposits, and then immediately begin studying how extraction might affect local organism population. The Agricultural Development Division complained that humans were more interested in cataloging native plant species than establishing efficient monocrop installation. The situation reached peak administrative absurdity when human researchers on Kepler 186f submitted a formal request to establish what they termed a genetic diversity preservation facility. They wanted to create a repository containing biological samples from every species on the planet, including microscopic organisms that existed solely to decompose organic matter and insects, whose primary function appeared to be annoying larger creatures. Their justification for this project included phrases like evolutionary heritage conservation and maintaining genetic resources for future generations. They spoke of preserving biological information as if it possessed inherent value, regardless of immediate commercial applications or practical utility. The humans had somehow convinced themselves that every organism, no matter how seemingly insignificant, played some crucial role in maintaining planetary stability. They mapped symbiotic relationships between species that had evolved elaborate interdependencies, documenting cooperation between creatures that rational species would have optimized out of existence through targeted selective pressure application. What made the situation particularly maddening was the humans' obvious intelligence. Their analytical capabilities were undeniable, their technological innovations impressive, and their research methodologies sophisticated beyond anything the Council had previously encountered. Yet they consistently applied these remarkable abilities towards studying biological phenomena that offered no apparent return on investment. Keth 9947's latest performance review had noted his declining efficiency in managing assigned species monitoring protocol. His supervisors were beginning to question whether human behavior patterns fell within normal parameters for newly contacted civilizations, or represented something requiring intervention from the Council's Psychological Evaluation Division. The humans, meanwhile, continued their bewildering ecological documentation with undiminished enthusiasm, treating each new species discovery as if they had uncovered fundamental truths about the universe, hidden in the migration patterns of aerial plankton and the reproductive cycles of sentient fungi. Nobody in the Council suspected that these seemingly irrational human priorities might actually represent the most advanced form of planetary management the galaxy had ever witnessed. The emergency session of the Galactic Environmental Preservation Council convened at 0400 Standard Time, which typically indicated either a bureaucratic catastrophe of unprecedented proportions, or someone had accidentally scheduled a meeting during third shift coffee break. Given that the hastily transmitted agenda contained only one item labeled Human Intervention Request Priority Classification, inexplicable, Keth 9947 suspected both scenarios might apply simultaneously. The conference chamber filled with representatives from 17 different species, each displaying varying degrees of administrative irritation and caffeine deficiency. Senior Administrator Vex Prime materialized via holographic projection from his vacation retreat on a pleasure moon, his digitized image flickering with the kind of technological instability that suggested he was transmitting through several layers of atmospheric interference and personal resentment. The crisis had originated from Tau Ceti, a world the Council had designated for complete resource extraction, following the unfortunate ecological collapse that had rendered 97% of its biosphere extinct. The planet represented a textbook case of efficient environmental management. Previous inhabitants had successfully eliminated most biological complications, leaving behind easily accessible mineral deposits and vast areas of simplified terrain perfect for industrial development. Standard extraction protocols called for atmospheric processing to begin within 6 standard months, followed by systematic mineral harvesting that would generate substantial returns for Council member species. The timeline was aggressive but achievable, assuming no unexpected complications arose from residual biological interference. The humans, naturally, had requested permission to study the dying world's remaining ecosystem before extraction commenced. The Council had approved this request with the weary resignation of bureaucrats, who had learned that denying human research proposals typically generated more paperwork than simply allowing them to document whatever biological curiosities remained on doomed planet. How much trouble could they cause studying the remnants of an already collapsed ecosystem? The answer, transmitted via priority channel at 0347 Standard Time, had been substantial enough to wake 17 different department heads and trigger emergency session protocols that hadn't been activated since the infamous Betelgeuse mining incident. Human Research Team Delta 7 had submitted a formal proposal for comprehensive and full ecosystem restoration of Tau Ceti, complete with detailed implementation schedules, resource requirements, and projected timelines that extended well beyond the approved extraction window. They were requesting indefinite postponement of mining operations to attempt rebuilding a planetary biosphere that rational species had already written off as economically obsolete. The proposal itself represented a masterpiece of scientific audacity that bordered on administrative terror. Human researchers had apparently spent their allocated study period mapping every surviving organism on Tau Cetia, cataloging species interactions with the obsessive thoroughness that had become their trademark throughout Council territory. They had identified remnant populations of creatures that existed in ecological fragments scattered across the planet's least hospitable region. More disturbing, they claimed to understand how these surviving species could be used to rebuild the entire planetary ecosystem through what they termed Cascade Restoration Protocol. Vex Prime's holographic form gestured toward the main display screen, with movements that suggested he was operating under the influence of recreational substances or profound disbelief. The screen showed human research data compiled during their 3-month study period, intricate diagrams mapping species relationships, population dynamics models, and restoration timelines that treated the planet's scattered biological remnants as components in some vast ecological reconstruction project. The humans had apparently discovered that certain surviving organisms, dismissed by previous surveys as evolutionary dead ends, actually served critical functions in maintaining soil chemistry, atmospheric gas cycles, and nutrient distribution networks. They had identified species that could re-establish symbiotic relationships with reintroduced flora, creating expanding zones of biological stability that would eventually merge into self-sustaining ecosystem networks. Their restoration plan involved reintroducing species in carefully calculated sequences, allowing each population to establish stable territories before adding organisms that depended on their environmental modification. They had mapped genetic diversity requirements, identified suitable breeding populations from specimens preserved in their mysterious biological repositories, and calculated resource flows through rebuilt food webs with mathematical precision that impressed even council analysts. The proposal included projections showing how restored ecosystems would eventually surpass the planet's original biological productivity, while maintaining indefinite sustainability. Human researchers claimed their techniques could transform Tau Cetia from a dying world into a thriving biosphere within 50 standard years, creating biological resources that would generate long-term value exceeding any mineral extraction profits. Keth 9947 found himself staring at data that challenged every assumption about human motivations he had developed during months of bewildered observation. The restoration plan was not some sentimental gesture toward preserving biological curiosity. It was a sophisticated technological proposal based on detailed understanding of how planetary ecosystems functioned as integrated systems. The humans had been studying alien ecology, not from academic curiosity, but as engineers analyzing complex biological machinery. Their obsession with seemingly insignificant organisms reflected recognition that every species, regardless of apparent economic value, performed specific functions within larger ecological networks that maintained planetary stability and productivity. Their useless research had been mapping the operating principles of biological systems, more complex and efficient than any technology the Council had ever encountered. While rational species approached planets as collections of extractable resources, humans apparently understood them as integrated biological machines capable of sustainable productivity, if properly maintained. The emergency session dissolved into heated debate as department heads grappled with implications that stretched beyond administrative inconvenience into fundamental questions about galactic resource management philosophy. If human restoration techniques actually worked, they represented technological capabilities that could revolutionize planetary development across Council territory. More unsettling was the growing realization that human behavior, previously dismissed as inexplicable ecological sentiment, might actually represent the most sophisticated approach to planetary resource management in galactic history. Their seemingly irrational priorities reflected understanding of biological principles that other species had overlooked in their rush toward immediate resource extraction. The vote to approve human restoration efforts on Tau Cetia passed by a narrow margin, largely because rejecting the proposal would have required explaining to oversight committees
why the Council had dismissed potentially revolutionary ecological technologies without proper evaluation. As the session concluded, Keth 9947 began preparing reports that would fundamentally restructure his understanding of human motivations and capability. The peculiar newcomers, who studied bacteria with religious devotion, were apparently practicing a form of planetary stewardship that other species had never imagined possible. 6 standard months after the Tau Cetia restoration project commenced, Keth 9947 received a data transmission that would fundamentally restructure his understanding of galactic civilization and possibly trigger an existential crisis that would require professional counseling. The message arrived through routine diplomatic channels, classified as historical context briefing, with the kind of bureaucratic understatement that typically preceded revelations capable of demolishing entire worldviews. The transmission contained humanity's complete ecological history. What Keth 9947 discovered while reviewing the files at 0300 hours in his dimly lit office would have impressed ancient philosophers who specialized in cosmic irony. The human, those peculiar beings who treated bacterial colonies like sacred artifacts and studied fungal reproduction cycles with religious devotion, came from a world where they had systematically destroyed their own planetary ecosystem through methods that would have impressed the most efficient resource extraction specialists in Council history. Earth's environmental record read like a masterpiece of ecological catastrophe, authored by species with a pathological inability to recognize long-term consequences. Humans had eliminated forests spanning entire continents, poisoned their atmosphere with industrial emissions, acidified their oceans through chemical runoff, and driven countless species extinct through habitat destruction that made Council mining operations appear environmentally sensitive by comparison. The truly remarkable aspect of human environmental history was not the scope of destruction they had achieved, but their species' eventual recognition that their approach to planetary resource management had been spectacularly counterproductive. They had learned through direct experience of ecological collapse that planetary ecosystems functioned as integrated biological networks, where eliminating seemingly insignificant components could trigger cascading failures that threatened civilizational survival. Humans had discovered the hard way that bacteria were not biological debris to be sterilized, but essential components in nutrient cycling systems that maintained soil fertility. They had learned that predators were not competitive threats to be eliminated, but regulatory mechanisms that prevented herbivore populations from destroying plant community. They had realized that wetlands were not wasteland to be drained for development, but water filtration systems, more efficient than any technological alternative. Their obsession with studying alien ecology was not academic curiosity or sentimental attachment to biological curiosity. It was the desperate application of hard-earned wisdom about how planetary systems actually functioned, combined with determination to avoid repeating their catastrophic mistakes on worlds throughout the galaxy. The files contained detailed records of human restoration projects on Earth, showing how they had gradually rebuilt damaged ecosystems through techniques that resembled the proposals they had submitted for Tau. They had learned to identify keystone species, whose reintroduction could stabilize entire ecological networks. They had developed methods for rebuilding soil microbiomes that supported complex plant community. They had mastered the delicate art of re-establishing predator-prey relationships that maintained biological balance without human intervention. Human ecological expertise represented survival knowledge acquired through centuries of environmental mistakes that had nearly eliminated their civilization. Every technique they applied to alien worlds reflected lessons learned from their own planetary near collapse. Meanwhile, reports from Tau Cetia were arriving with the kind of positive data that made Council economists question fundamental assumptions about resource management efficiency. Human restoration efforts had exceeded projected timelines, with expanding zones of biological activity, creating measurable improvements in atmospheric composition, soil chemistry, and hydrological cycle. Species reintroductions were proceeding according to schedule, with established populations supporting additional organism introductions that strengthened ecosystem stability. More significantly, Preliminary economic analyses suggested that restored biological productivity on Tau Ceti would generate long-term resource yields that surpassed original mineral extraction projections. The humans had essentially transformed a dying planet into a self-sustaining biological factory capable of indefinite productivity without depleting underlying resource bases. Other council territories were beginning to report similar results, where human ecological management techniques had been implemented. Worlds previously designated for standard resource extraction were experiencing biological recoveries that enhanced rather than competed with economic development. Human-managed ecosystems were proving more productive and sustainable than artificial alternatives that required constant technological intervention and resource inputs. The cosmic irony was becoming impossible to ignore. The galaxy's most technologically advanced species had approached planetary development with methods that maximized short-term resource extraction while creating long-term ecological instability. Meanwhile, the peculiar newcomers who studied microorganisms with obsessive dedication were practicing the most sophisticated form of planetary stewardship the galaxy had ever witnessed. Humans understood something that apparently escaped every other spacefaring civilization. Planets were not resource deposits to be mined, but complex biological machines that could provide indefinite productivity if properly maintained. Their seemingly irrational priorities reflected recognition that sustainable civilization required working with ecological systems rather than against. Keth 99947 submitted his final report on human activities, with conclusions that would probably trigger administrative reviews and possibly career reassignment. The species the council had initially dismissed as inefficient ecological sentimentalists were actually practicing advanced planetary management techniques based on understanding of biological principles that other civilizations had overlooked in their rush toward immediate resource extraction. The humans were not obsessed with alien ecology, despite their intelligence, but because of it. They had learned from their own mistakes what other species had yet to discover, that true galactic civilization required mastering the art of living sustainably within planetary ecosystems, rather than simply consuming them. As it turned out, the real primitives in this galactic community were not the species studying bacteria with reverent fascination, but those who had never learned the difference between resource management and resource destruction. The humans, with their peculiar dedication to preserving biological diversity and their inexplicable enthusiasm for ecological relationships, were simply the only species in the galaxy who had figured out how to build civilizations that could actually survive their own success. The universe, Keth 9947, reflected while updating his personnel files, where inevitable career transition possessed a remarkable sense of humor about which species would teach the galaxy how to grow up.